Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, network observability. SuzieQ is an open source project that collects, normalizes, stores, and analyzes multi-vendor network data. And this data becomes a foundation for network observability and automation. And today we talk with Dinesh Dutt, creator of SuzieQ and founder of Stardust Systems, which makes a commercial version of SuzieQ. And Stardust Systems is our sponsor for this Tech Byte. Dinesh, welcome back to Packet Pushers. Why should a network engineer care about SuzieQ? Are there concrete problems it can help solve?
Hey, Ethan. Hey, Drew. Thank you for having me. I would say, very simply put, time. Time is the most important commodity that any of us have. And I think network engineers are specifically short on time. I had this network automation talk at the Network Automation Forum where I said, tell me, one of you, please raise your hand and tell me that you have time. And one of the engineers shouted, my baby doesn't know I exist. So, so I think time is the most important commodity that people have, and network engineers especially. And SuzieQ gives you back time. From a business perspective, time is money. And basically what this translates to, if I kind of step down from motherhood and apple pie a little bit, is I want to kind of not tell you what I think, but instead tell you what users, customers of SuzieQ Enterprise and open source users have told me. The first thing they say is, Dinesh, SuzieQ gives me back time because it allows me to be accurate and efficient. In general, if you think about a network engineer, they are asked questions every day in various different ways, whether it be, hey, why can't A talk to B, which is a thing that pretty much everyone pivots on, or the moment you hear network automation, everybody else pivots on, how do I validate any changes I've made? But that generally is a small part of a network operator's life. A network operator on a day-to-day basis does a lot of things. Outages are the thing that gets everybody's attention because it's like the heroic thing. It's the wildfire. However, what I hear from a lot of network operators, engineers, architects is it's death by 1,000 cuts. What I have on Monday morning is not the same thing on a Tuesday morning or a Friday morning. And it's different each time. And one of the problems they have is how do we then try and get the time back to us in all of these different ways, not just when there's a wildfire. So when people tell me, I ask them, okay, what do you mean by saying SuzieQ allows you to be more accurate and efficient? They said, today, Dinesh, somebody comes and asks us a simple question. What subnets are used by access points? How do I even begin to attempt to answer that question? Another user comes along, another user said, I'm asked a question, we are doing a network refresh. I want to know what VLANs are not used. Think about the trade-off that I have to do between being accurate and making an estimate. If I'm accurate, it's going to take time. If I'm making an estimate, it means there will be mistakes. With SuzieQ, I don't have to make that trade-off. I can pretty easily answer the question of what subnets are used by access points. It took me 5 minutes to figure out how to ask SuzieQ the question, and I was done. It took me almost no time to figure out what VLANs are not used. Another example, people wanted to do a network refresh, and they wanted to know how many ports have not been used in the last quarter. And that's a fairly complex thing, especially when you think about a campus where ports come on and off, and we've just gone through COVID. So many ports were off, but now they're coming on, et cetera, et cetera. And they needed to know that because they wanted to understand when they go from a Catalyst 3850 to a 9500, a very common procedure amongst many campus networks today, they didn't know how many ports they actually needed to use. But with SuzieQ, it was very easy for them to figure out how many ports were actually not used in the last 3 months. And so they got their answer done. And so they were able to reduce on how many switches they were able to save, money on switches. So that was a direct CapEx saving. I could go on, but essentially the fundamental point is SuzieQ gives you the ability to be accurate and efficient. And basically, if you think about it from another perspective, it is automation without the hardship. And it allows you to, like I said again, answer a bunch of different questions that people face every day, not just when there's a wildfire. Another user, I want to stop my answer by quoting another user who said, Dinesh, using SuzieQ was like turning the light on.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe a good place to pivot then, because you're talking about observability, but how is that different from just network monitoring, which is what we've been doing for decades?
To quote Shakespeare, a rose by any name is as sweet. So
this is a very distinguished podcast episode. Into Shakespeare.
to quote the bard. Um, so I think fundamentally, if you really think about network monitoring and observability, I think a lot of people focus on, hey, all I'm doing is pulling data. What's the difference? And I think the primary difference is what you're doing with the data and what kinds of data are you pulling. At some level, you're pulling data, you're trying to figure out by looking at this data, answer questions about your network, whether the performance is okay, why is my BGP session down when it's not supposed to be down. Whatever your question is, you could answer that with network monitoring if you pulled out all the questions, all the data to be able to answer those questions. But typically, what I see is different about observability, and this is a personal perspective. If you talk to people, you'll find most people talk about observability the way compute people talk about observability, which is it's to troubleshoot. Right. I look at observability as actually a very different perspective. I see observability as allowing people to work with their networks in ways that they couldn't work otherwise. And like I mentioned earlier, CapEx saving, that's not a thing people attribute to observability. But once you have the ability to observe and ask these open-ended questions, you can start to actually do things with the tool at hand, which you couldn't do otherwise. So to your question, how is observability different from network monitoring? I would say one fundamental difference that I personally see, and therefore SuzieQ works that way, is network monitoring is giving you dashboards that allow you to look at things. SuzieQ then allows you to say, okay, what then? What's next?
Yes, the difference in my mind is a network monitoring system looks at network elements. In fact, network element manager is part of the viewpoint versus looking at the network as a holistic system.
Exactly. Bingo, Ethan. That's what I say all the time. SuzieQ allows you to look at the network holistically. Again, to quote users, because I feel like, this is a sponsored podcast and I need to do some marketing, but I also don't want to do users a disservice. You've all heard enough marketing. I want to take quotes from users and be able to tell you. And two things that comes back to me again in this specific point that you make, Ethan, is, Dinesh, the first thing I get from SuzieQ is I get a great overview of the network. I don't have to ask anybody. I know very quickly because of summary what is going on in the network. Oh, I'm using VXLAN. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I get like 6 things right away answered without having to talk to anyone. And guess what? We just onboarded 2 network engineers. I didn't have to spend time with them. I just pointed them to the GUI and said, go figure it out. And they had the answers. So I think that particular point you make, Ethan, about the fact that observability allows you to look at the network holistically is a fundamental point. And that ability to look at the network holistically means you can ask questions that you could not ask before.
Dinesh, you've been to the AutoCon events put on by the Network Automation Forum, even delivered the keynote at AutoCon 1 in Amsterdam. SuzieQ, we're talking about it as an observability tool, but there's a tie into network automation as well. Explain that tie-in.
So one of the things I said in the keynote is, there is this notion that today, what is network automation is different for a very long time. And in fact, if you look at Network Automation Forum talks, they were all focused on config generation. There are a couple of exceptions, but in general, they were all focused on config generation. I use Netbox maybe, or I didn't use Netbox. I had some mechanism whereby I had Jinja templates and I pushed these things out. That's generally what most people think about as network automation. But the way I look at it is network automation is essentially the ability to act on, back to your point, Ethan, holistically on the system. This is what, for example, someone who started SDN thought they could do because they were having a God's view of the network. But now this is a God's view of the network without the crap that SDN came with, simply because that tried to solve the problem in a completely different way. And we don't have to take the time to get into the philosophy of SDN. But the point is, the way it ties into network automation is you're not just automating configuration push. It's what do you do before you decide to push the configuration. It's what do you do after you push the configuration. And then What about the rest of the days? There is automation happening all the time. For example, one of the users said, hey, Dinesh, I had this question. And because I ask all the customers, hey, if you guys run into anything interesting that you use SuzieQ for, please let me know. And one of the questions I got back, hey, Dinesh, you would love this. I got asked this question. I didn't ask them for what specific reason, but this is a bank. They were asked the question, what are the number of VLANs that have more than 4 unique MAC addresses up my uplink ports? They needed it for some specific reason. Just think about what it would take them to answer that question. With SuzieQ, it was a one-line command. They got the answer, and they wanted to tell me that. And that's the thing that you can do with respect to automation. They didn't do any automation. They didn't write any code. They didn't do anything. They just typed MAC, unique, and a set of keywords, and they got the answer. So that's an example of how SuzieQ ties into network automation, because it lets you do every single thing that you do on a device-by-device basis holistically across the network.
Is SuzieQ doing the discovery, or is SuzieQ pulling from existing network data sources that I have?
So actually today, it is basically pulling from the network sources you have, whether it be Ansible inventory, whether it be your own provided inventory, or it is the inventory coming out of Netbox. Or anything equivalent. People have also used it with Notabot. Where we are going with the next release of the enterprise is we have actually added discovery. So you will also get discovery. You can supply a couple of IP address subnets and we'll go discover the network. Today, you already have the ability with whatever you discover to find out, are there compliance-wise unauthorized devices connected to your network? You can say, show me all the devices that SuzieQ doesn't know about, and we can tell you that. So they catch compliance from that perspective as well. But today, if you just picked a release today, then you would get from the sources that you have, plus your own. And starting from the next release, which is coming out in the next week or two, you'll have discovery as well.
Okay, so that raises a good question, because typically with open source and commercial products, there's some differences between capabilities. Are there things I can get from SuzieQ Enterprise that I don't get with open source?
Yes. Once upon a time, the answer was only one thing, but now things have evolved quite a bit that you get a whole bunch of different things with enterprise that you can't get with open source. And I'll just name a couple of them, and we can talk about the rest if you want, when there is if there is time. Two simple things. You can do path trace across all your sites. One of the things that the enterprise, the open source cannot do is if you've got, say, for example, data center 1 in Frankfurt, data center 2 in North Carolina, you couldn't trace if a VM moved. Why would VMs move? Don't ask me. People still do L2 across stretched L2. So I'm not going to go there. But without judgment, when you have these kinds of things happen, we couldn't trace path in the open. You can't trace path across sites. With the enterprise, you can trace path across the sites. That's the first thing. The second thing you can do with the enterprise that you can't do with open source is you can do what is called netbox sync. Everybody has brownfield networks. Very few people have greenfield networks. And in a brownfield network, Netbox is supposed to solve automation, but guess how we do it? We have to manually enter the 500 devices that we've got information on right now in order to get started. That is really the wrong way to go about things. And so one of the things you can do with SuzieQ is you can take the information that SuzieQ discovers and use that to push the information into Netbox. And more importantly than that, you can actually use SuzieQ to say, show me. So for example, you want to do intent-based networking, and the road to hell is paved with the intent. So I won't get into the mess of intent-based networking, but let's take a simple thing of, I just want to validate that the interface's MTU is what I configured in Netbox, because Netbox is my data source of truth. That's what I expect to configure. When I configure, where do I go look for the data? It's in Netbox or Notabot, or pick your favorite. It's a YAML file. But the point is, you want to validate that. And everybody who does automation knows any coding which duplicates, where you have duplicates means you have errors. It would be much nicer to say, I expect the interface to match what's in Netbox. So that's another thing you can do with enterprise that you can't do with open source. Finally, you can build custom asserts that are specific to your network. Your network has a set of VLANs that's unique to you and that keeps changing. You want to be able to assert, hey, I want to validate that I only have these VLANs and nothing more. Or you want to configure a new VLAN and you want to assert before you start your network that this VLAN does not exist. You can do those. The last part I will say is we allow in the enterprise to work with external databases. We have customers who actually interface SuzieQ with policy database like Cisco ICE, pull information from Cisco ICE, merge the information with SuzieQ merges the information that it pulls from Cisco ICE along with the information it has about the network, and then is able to answer policy questions for you. For example, these are the set of MAC addresses according to Cisco ICE that should be assigned a DHCP. Are they the ones that have been assigned the DHCP? You can answer those questions. You don't have to try and pull all of this, do manual stitching yourself, do 20 other things. SuzieQ does that for you. So that's another way in which SuzieQ Enterprise is superior or does things or has capabilities that the open source does not have. And then their list goes on. We support wireless in the enterprise, which we don't support in the open source. We support spanning tree, DHCP, more devices like Cisco ACI, wireless devices like Catalyst wireless controllers, all of those. And we keep adding new devices as customers keep asking them. So all of that is in the enterprise compared to the open source.
Now, SuzieQ is in a growing space, network observability. How would you distinguish SuzieQ's approach to observability from other products that might be out there, Dinesh?
I would say I think because the way I think about observability is different, that thought or that philosophy is built into everything that is there in SuzieQ. Let's start with something very trivial, what you see is the thing that you can start with. And if you look at SuzieQ, it's about the only tool I know that gives you a CLI, a GUI, and an API. Doesn't matter whether you're a CLI jockey or you're a GUI person or you're a DevOps ninja, you can use SuzieQ in any way you want. You don't have to know programming. You don't have to use curl or any REST API. On the other hand, you want to integrate it because you know where you're already ahead of the curve in some ways with network automation. You can choose to do that too. Or for example, think about topology. No CLI or API will help you actually look at a topology without a graphical user interface. SuzieQ allows you to do that. So we, from an observability perspective, how are we different is we allow different modalities of interfacing with the system so that you can use whatever modality makes sense to you for the task you have at hand, which is not really true of any other tool that I'm aware of. Most of them give you a GUI. And then how do I ask the question of how many VLANs are there that have more than 4 unique MAC addresses across my uplinks? No way to do that. Or how do you make custom assertions? You can have a set of things and you can click, click, click. How do you write those things? How do you test those? I mean, the list goes on. The second way is I designed SuzieQ to be open-ended. And what I mean by open-ended is multiple things. First is because SuzieQ is designed, think of it what the user said, which is, hey, using SuzieQ was like turning the light on. A lot of people have flashlights. They can point to performance problems in a particular corner, or they can point to a validation. I wanted SuzieQ to be the light on in the room, or it could be used also to pinpoint and look at a particular darker corner that you wanted to focus on a little more that just the overall brightness did not achieve. So it's open-ended in the sense that you can use it for doing specific tasks like post-config validation or pre-config validation, or to do open-ended things that you deal with day to day as a network engineer that you otherwise don't have the ability to look at. This also means that we avoid tool sprawl, right? One of the things is tools have switched from using tools, and this is part of the problem is using tools means I switch from having to deal with 10 different devices with 10 different CLIs to 10 different tools, and I got to understand which tool do I use for what. And because they're all isolated in their own way, this kind of cross connect, like I talked about Cisco ICE database with the network state, is not possible without sophisticated programming. The fact that you can do that easily is what I mean by open-ended. It's also open-ended in the sense of what we can add support for. Because it's observability, I don't think about observability as very specific to troubleshooting. So, for example, coming out in the next release is the ability for you to do license management. You can look at licenses, what licenses are deployed, how they are deployed across, because this is an important problem that you need to solve, but you don't have the tools to do it. And typically you look at a completely different tool to do it.
Yeah.
To again quote a user, how come I have 150 tools and I still can't get them to answer any of the questions that SuzieQ can? So this was a quote from a real customer. I'm not trying to pick one. So the ability to interface with it and use the modality of interaction that makes sense, to be open-ended in the tasks that you can perform, and the fact that it can integrate with what you have means you can function in ways with observability and use it for things that you don't generally think about using it for.
Well, if you've piqued people's listeners' interests in SuzieQ, where can they go to try the open source version?
Google SuzieQ network and you should take you to GitHub. There is GitHub. There is also a way to reach out to us via Stardust Systems. So either of those two ways, you can reach out to us.
Awesome. We'll have those links in the show notes that accompany this podcast.
Thank you. And I want to just say, please, I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you how SuzieQ can save you time. Download SuzieQ, use it. Reach out via Stardust Systems, and let's figure out how to make this work, because this is a labor of love for me.
Well, thank you, Dinesh, for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for being with us. You can find this and many more fine, free technical podcasts along with our community blog. That's all at packetpushers.net. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can hear us on Spotify. If you leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, that would be great. If you want to join our community on Slack, where you can talk with other network engineers, just go to packetpushers.net/community. Last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.